For 24 years, a daughter was locked in a hidden cellar by her own father, controlling every breath she took and forcing her to bear 7 children. A father's love should protect, but for her, it became a life sentence. This is not fiction. This is not a movie. This is the real story the world could barely believe. Elisabeth Fritzl was born on April 6, 1966, the fourth of 7 children. Her early years were quiet, defined by her father's strictness and her mother Rosemary's gentler presence. She learned early to navigate a household where rules were absolute and questions were not always welcome. Teachers described her as shy but polite, a good student who kept to herself. As she grew, she discovered small pockets of freedom. She enjoyed baking with her mother, playing in the backyard with her younger siblings, and sketching in a small notebook she kept hidden in her room. At school, she dreamed of one day becoming a hairdresser or a waitress, jobs that would allow her to meet people, to see more of the world than this small Austrian town could offer. But her father's shadow was long. Josef Fritzl was not the kind of man who let go easily. He decided where his children went, who they saw, what they could and could not do. And when Elisabeth briefly ran away at the age of 16, it was a wound to his pride that he would never forget. She returned within weeks, brought back by police. But to Joseph, the act itself was enough to justify what came next. It was the afternoon of August 28, 1984. The summer air outside was warm and soft, the kind that carries the faint scent of cut grass and distant rain. Inside the Fritzl home, the smell was different, cool still with a hint of damp from the basement below. Joseph was in his work clothes, his sleeves rolled up, moving between the hallway and the cellar door. "Elisabeth," he called from the bottom of the stairs, his voice steady. "Come down a moment. I need your help with something." She was upstairs folding laundry. She hesitated. She didn't often go into the basement. "What is it?" she asked, her voice light but cautious. "Just a door I need to carry," he replied. "It's too heavy for me alone." She wiped her hands on her skirt and walked to the top of the basement stairs. Joseph was standing below, his eyes fixed on her in that way she had always found difficult to read, half stern, half expectant. As she descended, the air grew cooler, tinged with the smell of concrete and wood shavings. The basement was dim, lit by a single bulb. She saw the door leaning against the wall, thick and solid, its surface raw and unfinished. "Where's it going?" she asked, stepping closer. "Just to the back," he said, nodding toward the far wall. "I built a new storage room, you'll see." They lifted the door together, the weight forcing them to move slowly. Joseph guided her toward a narrow passageway she had never noticed before. 2 steps down, then a short corridor, leading to another heavy door already standing ajar. "This is new," she said, frowning. "I told you," he replied. "More storage space. It's safer this way." They maneuvered the door inside. The room beyond was smaller than she expected. Low ceiling, concrete walls, and in the corner, a simple bed frame, a small table, and shelves bolted into the wall. It smelled faintly of fresh paint and something metallic. She set her end of the door down and straightened up, brushing her hair from her face. "What are you keeping in here?" she asked. Joseph's eyes didn't leave her. "You," he said quietly. The words landed before she could process them. "What?" Before she could step back, he moved. The door they had carried in became a barrier as he swung it into place. Heavy bolts slid with a final echoing scrape. She lunged toward the opening, but his frame blocked it entirely. "Papa!" "You'll be safe here," he said, his voice flat. "You won't try to run again." Her breath came sharp and fast. She pushed against the door, pounded it with her fists. "Let me out!" But the sound was swallowed instantly by the thick walls. Above, the world went on. Footsteps across the kitchen floor, the distant hum of a passing car. Below, the only sound was the faint click of a lock, sealing her away from everything she had ever known. When the final bolt slid into place, the first thing that hit Elisabeth was the silence. Not the natural kind that comes when a room is still, but a thick, unnatural quiet that pressed in from every side. The walls seemed to absorb her voice before it could travel anywhere. She called out, the words falling flat in the stale air. The room was not empty, but it was stripped of anything familiar. A narrow bed against one wall, a small table, a single chair, a sink with a slow drip of water. Shelves bolted to the concrete held a few folded blankets and a stack of canned food. The light overhead buzzed faintly, the kind of light that never changed no matter the time of day. There was no window, no way to tell morning from night. Minutes stretched into hours. Elisabeth walked the length of the room again and again, tracing the walls with her fingertips, as if searching for a seam that might open. Every surface was solid. The air felt cool but dry, and it carried no trace of the outside, no wind, no scent of earth or grass. At some point, Josef returned, unlocking the door, long enough to slide in a tray with a plate of food and a bottle of water. He said little. The door closed again with the same heavy finality. That night, she lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, the bulb casting a pale, steady glow. Sleep didn't come easily. She thought about her mother, her brothers and sisters. Were they looking for her? Did they believe she had left? The last memory of the upstairs world, carrying that door, replayed in her mind until it felt unreal. In the days that followed, she began to understand the rhythms of her new reality. Josef would come down at certain times, bringing food or small supplies. He never stayed long. The rest of the time she was alone with her thoughts. The concrete around her was not just a wall, it was a barrier to every sound, every sight, every smell of life outside. The absence of natural light became the hardest part. Without the sun to mark the hours, time dissolved into an unbroken line. She tried to create her own schedule, waking, cleaning the small space, pacing to keep her legs from stiffening. She counted in her head to measure minutes, but it was easy to lose track. As the first weeks turned into months, the reality settled over her like a second skin. The basement was no longer a place she entered. It was the entirety of her world. Outside, seasons would change, people would celebrate holidays, the town would go about its life. Inside, nothing changed except the slow rearrangement of her own hope, which began to move from escape to survival. And survival, she began to see, was going to require something more than waiting. It was going to require endurance. The first time she begged him to let her out, her voice was raw from crying. Days had passed with the same walls closing in, and the thought that this might be permanent was beginning to sink into her bones. When she heard the locks turning, her heart jumped. Perhaps her dad had changed his mind. She stood as the door opened, tears already running down her face. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't stay here. I'll be good, I promise. Just let me go." Joseph's eyes were unreadable, his expression flat in a way that made the air between them colder. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. There was no kindness in his movements. His presence filled the room not like a rescue, but like a shadow that blocked even the faintest light. Elisabeth stepped back, her voice breaking. "Papa, please. I'll do anything. Just don't keep me here." What came next was not rescue. It was control, sharpened into cruelty. He ignored her tears, ignored her words, and treated her not as a daughter, but as something he owned. It was an act that would be repeated, not once, not twice, but over and over in the months and years to come. A cycle of fear and violation that blurred the days together. When it was over, she was left in the same room, her body shaking, her mind reeling. The door closed with its familiar scrape of bolts. She listened to the sound fade, the air still thick with the weight of what had happened. She curled on the bed, pulled the blanket tight around herself and wept until her throat ached. In the silence that followed, she understood with a clarity that cut deep. There would be no one coming to save her soon. She would have to survive not just the walls, but the man who had put them there. 4 years into her captivity, the air in the cellar felt heavier than ever. The walls that had once been bare now closed in with a new weight. Elisabeth was pregnant. The reality had settled over her, like a slow-moving storm. She had no doctor, no midwife, no clean ward waiting to receive her. Only the small, damp room and the man who had put her there. When she first told Joseph, her voice was almost a whisper. She hoped somewhere deep inside that the news might soften him, make him see she needed real help. but instead of concern, his face was unreadable. "You'll manage," he said, as if it were a small task. When she asked if she could go to a hospital, his answer was sharp and final. "No, no one can know." Days later, Joseph returned with a cardboard box. Inside was a battered medical book, its pages yellow, diagrams marked in ink. Alongside it were a few supplies: towels, scissors, disinfectant, a handful of basic items she barely knew how to use. "This will tell you what to do," he said, placing the book on the table. His tone carried no reassurance, only the blunt weight of an order. Then the door shut and she was alone again. The months passed in a blur of fear and uncertainty. She read the medical book at night, tracing the printed diagrams with trembling fingers, memorizing the steps as if they could replace the skill of trained hands. The cramped cellar became her world of preparation, folding the towels again and again, boiling water on the hot plate to make sure it was clean, rehearsing in her mind. How she would bring a life into a place meant only for captivity. When the time came, it was night, though night meant little here, where the same electric light shone around the clock. The air was close and warm. Pain came in waves, sharp and consuming, and there was no one to hold her hand, no voice to tell her she was safe. She followed the instructions from the book, moving between the bed and the small table, doing what she had read she must do, her breath ragged, her hands shaking. And then, in the midst of the fear, the pain and the isolation, there was a new sound, thin, high, and alive. A newborn cry filled the room for the first time. She wrapped the baby, her daughter, in a towel, holding her close against her chest. There were tears on her face, but not from relief alone. She knew that, while she had brought life into the world, it was a world without sunlight, without grass underfoot, without the freedom every child should have. She pressed her cheek against the tiny head, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep, but knew she had to make. "One day, you'll see the sky." The first days with Kirsten in the cellar were unlike anything Elisabeth had ever experienced. She had expected exhaustion, yes, the kind every new mother feels, but not this particular kind, the one born of being both parent and prison survivor at the same time. There was no sunlight to help the baby's tiny body, no day from night, no fresh air to clear the mustiness from her lungs. The same dim bulb glowed above them, unchanging, indifferent to the rhythm of life it now presided over. Feeding was constant in those early weeks. Elisabeth would sit on the bed, cradling Kirsten, rocking her gently as the baby's small cries echoed off the concrete walls. She learned to pace the room with slow, steady steps, her bare feet tracing the same path over and over to calm the child. The sound of the hot plate heating water became part of the soundtrack of their lives. The smell of warm milk, the faint scent of baby skin, these were the only fresh things in the stale air. Everything was done by improvisation. Baby clothes were hand-me-downs Joseph brought in, sometimes far too big, sometimes too small. There were no bottles until she begged for one. Nappies were rationed. She washed them by hand in the small sink, the cold water biting her fingers. The towels that had been used for the birth were washed and folded, ready again, because in this place, nothing could be wasted. Joseph came and went, according to his own schedule, which Elisabeth could never predict. Sometimes he brought food and supplies. Other times he left nothing at all but his presence, heavy and suffocating. Kirsten would cry when he entered, though she was too small to understand. Why the air seemed to change whenever the door opened. The hardest moments came in the quiet hours, when Kirsten finally slept, and Elisabeth was alone with her thoughts. She imagined what her daughter's life could have been: a crib in a room with a window, walks outside in the fresh morning air, visits from grandparents, laughter in a park. Instead, her baby's first memories would be of these four walls, the constant electric hum, and a mother's face lit by artificial light. Elisabeth refused to let despair show when Kirsten was awake. She smiled for her, talked to her, told her stories about the world beyond the cellar. She described the green of the fields, the sound of rain on a roof, the way the wind moves through tall trees. She wanted her daughter's mind, even from the beginning, to be filled with more than what she could see. This became her new routine, to fill the gaps the cellar imposed, to make a childhood out of nothing but willpower and love. And though every day began and ended under the same unchanging light, Elisabeth kept one thought alive. She was not only surviving for herself anymore, she was surviving for Kirsten. By 1990, the cellar had settled into a rhythm that was both predictable and exhausting. Days blurred, marked only by meals and the rare sound of the locks turning. Kirsten, now a toddler, had learned to walk within the confines of those few square meters. She toddled from bed to wall, from sink to shelf, tracing paths that ended where they began. Her laughter was rare but precious, a sound that momentarily cut through the monotony. When Elisabeth realized she was pregnant again, the mix of emotions was sharper than before. She remembered the fear of Kirsten's birth, the pain, the isolation, and yet she also knew that another child would be another reason to endure. When she told Joseph, his reaction was almost mechanical. No hospital, no doctor. He brought another box of supplies, another old medical book, and told her she knew what to do. Months passed, the air in the cellar thick with the smell of damp concrete and recycled breath. Elisabeth juggled caring for Kirsten and preparing for the new arrival. She washed and folded every scrap of fabric she had, turned boxes into makeshift cribs, and read through the medical book again and again as if repetition could turn her into a midwife. The birth of Stefan came in the same unchanging light that had witnessed Kirsten's. There was no rush to a hospital, no call for help, just Elisabeth, alone, working through each wave of pain. While Kirsten watched from the bed, clutching a worn piece of cloth in her small hands. Hours later, a new cry joined the air. Stefan was tiny, fragile, his skin pale from the start. Elisabeth held him close, the warmth of his body anchoring her in that moment. Life in the cellar shifted again. 2 children meant twice the needs, twice the noise, and twice the reasons to keep going. Feeding schedules overlapped, sleep became even scarcer, and the limited space seemed to shrink. Elisabeth rearranged the room, moving the bed, shifting the table, making the narrow space work for a family that was never meant to be here. Kirsten became a quiet helper in her own way, fetching cloths, handing Elisabeth small items. She didn't know any other life, so she accepted this one without question. The games Elisabeth invented grew more elaborate, scavenger hunts among the meager belongings, storytelling sessions that turned the concrete walls into castles or forests in her children's minds. Yet, beneath the daily routines was a deep, unspoken truth. The cellar was not just a home, it was a cage. And Elisabeth knew that with each year that passed, the outside world was moving further away, becoming something her children might only ever know through her words. By 1994, a full decade had passed since the door had closed behind Elisabeth. Kirsten was 6 now, quiet and perceptive beyond her years. Stefan was 4, lively but restless, always testing the limits of their tiny world. The cellar was no larger than it had ever been, but with 2 growing children it felt increasingly cramped. Every object had its place out of necessity, every inch of floor space accounted for. When Elisabeth realized she was pregnant again, the weight of the news was almost unbearable. She knew exactly what it would mean: another child to care for, another small life trapped in the same unchanging air. She had no illusions left about Joseph's response. As before, there would be no hospital, no professional care, and as before, she would have to bring a child into the world entirely alone. Joseph's preparation was minimal and cold. He brought down a few additional supplies: an old crib, more towels, a bundle of clothes far too big for a newborn. There was no comfort in his visits, only the sense of control he carried like a constant shadow. When Elisabeth asked for fresh food or vitamins, he dismissed the requests or brought them in quantities too small to matter. The months of waiting were long and exhausting. Elisabeth's body ached from caring for 2 young children while carrying another. Kirsten and Stefan watched her carefully, sensing the change, but too young to fully understand. She tried to reassure them, telling stories about the baby in her tummy, painting pictures of a new playmate who would join their games. It was as much for herself as it was for them. When the time came, it was the same as before. No rush to safety, no one to call for help. The light overhead buzzed faintly, the walls closing in as the hours passed. Kirsten sat quietly on the bed, holding Stefan close, while Elisabeth worked through the pain alone. Every sound echoed, each movement felt amplified in the confined space. And then finally Lisa was born. Elisabeth wrapped her in a soft towel and held her close, feeling the tiny heartbeat against her own. She whispered promises into the newborn's ear, promises of love, of care, and of a world beyond these walls, even though she didn't know when or if she could keep them. Life in the cellar transformed again. 3 children meant constant motion. Feedings, washing, teaching, soothing. The cycle never ended. The space, already small, now felt almost impossible to manage. Joseph's visits were still unpredictable, his control absolute. Supplies were rationed. Elisabeth made everything stretch, as far as it could. But in the midst of the hardship there were moments, fleeting but real, that felt like victories. Kirsten singing softly to her baby sister, Stefan learning to write his name in uneven letters, Lisa smiling for the first time, her eyes opening to a world she couldn't yet see beyond these walls. And so, even as the air felt heavier and the days longer, Elisabeth found herself holding on. For every moment of despair, there was a small reason to push forward, and those reasons all had names. After Lisa's birth, the cellar felt as if it had shrunk overnight. 3 small beds now crowded the walls, and every corner was filled, with some essential item, clothes stacked on shelves, tins of food, buckets for washing. Movement had to be careful, deliberate, and Elisabeth was always watching, making sure no one tripped over the few precious things they had. It was in the spring of 1995, when Joseph announced something unexpected. He was taking Lisa upstairs. Elisabeth was stunned. He explained in his matter-of-fact way that Rosemary would find the baby on their doorstep, just as his story to the outside world claimed had happened before. He told Elisabeth this would make life easier for her, with fewer mouths to feed in the cellar. But for Elisabeth, the decision was like losing a part of herself. She had cared for Lisa every moment since birth, taught her to sit up, to walk, to say her first words, and now she would disappear into the world above, living under a lie. Joseph carried Lisa away. Hours later, Elisabeth could only imagine the scene upstairs. Rosemary finding the baby with a note, believing the story, that her missing daughter had left another child for her to raise. Down below, the cellar felt emptier, even with Kirsten and Stefan still there. 1996 brought another pregnancy, twins this time, Michael and Alexander. The birth was more dangerous than any before. Space in the cellar was already limited, and the supplies Joseph provided were barely enough for 1 newborn, let alone 2. Michael, the smaller twin, struggled from the start. Elisabeth begged Joseph to take him to a hospital, but he refused. She did everything she could to keep him alive, but after 3 days Michael died in her arms. It was the first time death had entered their small world. Joseph took the tiny body away and later admitted to burning it in the household furnace. Alexander, the surviving twin, was eventually taken upstairs like Lisa before him. By 1998, Monica was born, another baby delivered in the same dim light, on the same narrow bed. Joseph repeated the same pattern. After several months, Monica was taken upstairs, found by Rosemary, and raised as if she were simply another of Elisabeth's abandoned children. For Elisabeth, the pattern became a cruel rhythm: pregnancy, birth, the early months of constant care, and then the wrenching separation, when Joseph decided to take the child upstairs. Each loss was its own kind of grief, but she learned to hide her pain from the children who remained with her. Then, in 2002, came Felix. By this time, Kirsten was 14, Stefan 12. They were old enough to understand that their world was not the same as the one they heard in their mother's stories. Elisabeth poured herself into caring for Felix, determined that he would be surrounded by love, even in this place. For reasons he never explained, Joseph kept Felix in the cellar rather than taking him upstairs. From then on, the downstairs family was fixed: Kirsten, Stefan, Felix, and their mother. Above them lived Lisa, Alexander, and Monica, raised by Rosemary and told the lie that their mother had abandoned them. The two worlds existed in the same house but never touched. By the time 2008 arrived, Elisabeth had given birth to 7 children in total. Kirsten, born 1988, remained in Cellar. Stefan, born 1990, remained in Cellar. Lisa, born 1992, taken upstairs. Monica, born 1994, taken upstairs. Twins Michael and Alexander, born 1996. Michael died in Cellar after 3 days. Alexander taken upstairs. Felix, born 2002, remained in Cellar. Every child had been born without medical care. Every birth had taken place in that hidden space under the same unchanging bulb, surrounded by concrete. And with each one, Elisabeth's resolve to protect and nurture them grew, even as her own freedom remained locked behind steel bolts. By the spring of 2008, the weight of the years was showing in every corner of the cellar. Kirsten was now 19, Stefan 17, and Felix 6. They had grown up without sunlight, without seasons, without the freedom to take even one step beyond the reinforced door. Elisabeth had done everything she could to give them an education, teaching them to read, to write, to imagine the world beyond their walls, but she could not give them what they needed most, the simple, vital connection to the outside world. That April, Kirsten began to feel unwell. At first, it was nothing Elisabeth hadn't seen before: fatigue, a cough, restlessness. But within days the symptoms worsened. Kirsten complained of dizziness and severe stomach pain. Her skin turned pale and her movements slowed. The confined air in the cellar seemed to grow heavier around her. Elisabeth tried everything she could. She made her lie down, rationed food to give her only the softest meals, and held damp cloths to her forehead. But nothing worked. The illness deepened, and soon Kirsten could barely sit up. Her eyes had a distant, glazed look, and her speech came in broken, disoriented sentences. For the first time in years, Elisabeth's fear shifted from survival to desperation. She knew this was beyond her ability to fix. She approached Joseph during one of his visits, her voice sharp with urgency. "She's not getting better," she told him. "She needs a doctor, now." Joseph brushed her off at first, saying she would recover in time. But Kirsten's condition grew worse with each passing hour. By the end of the week, she was slipping in and out of consciousness. Her breathing became shallow, her skin clammy. Elisabeth stood over her eldest child, terrified she might die right there, in the same hidden place she had been born. Finally, under pressure he could no longer ignore, Joseph relented, but only partially. He agreed to take Kirsten to a hospital under the condition that Elisabeth would write a letter, explaining that her daughter had been left with her father and raised in secrecy. The letter would claim Elisabeth herself had gone into hiding years before. On April 19, 2008, Joseph carried Kirsten out of the cellar for the first time in her life. Elisabeth stood in the narrow space, holding Felix close, watching as the door closed once again. She didn't know if she would ever see her daughter again. At the Amstetten hospital, doctors were shocked by Kirsten's condition. She was critically ill, suffering from a life-threatening infection caused by untreated health issues. Her body showed signs of long-term vitamin deficiency, something that could only come from years without sunlight. The medical staff, puzzled by her background, began asking questions. Those questions began to reach the police. Joseph, sensing the growing suspicion, told Elisabeth she would have to help explain. But in his arrogance, he didn't see that the chain of secrecy he had built over 24 years was starting to break. When Joseph finally came back with news from the hospital, his face was tight, his voice low. Joseph gave her a strict set of instructions. She was to tell the police and doctors the story he had crafted years ago, that she had run away as a teenager to join a cult, that she had secretly given her father her children to raise, and that she had been living elsewhere in hiding. It was the lie he had told everyone, and he expected her to play her part flawlessly. On April 26, 2008, Joseph led Elisabeth out of the cellar. The cold night air hit her face, like a wave she wasn't ready for. After more than 2 decades underground, the sensation of breathing fresh air was almost overwhelming, sharp, clean, and unfamiliar. Her eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness of the streetlights, the distant hum of cars, the sound of the wind moving through trees. She wanted to stop, to stand still and take it in, but Joseph kept walking, his hand gripping her arm. At first, fear kept her silent. She had lived under Joseph's threats for so long, she could almost hear his voice in her head, warning her of what would happen if she spoke. But as the hours passed, the weight of the truth became too much to hold in. Quietly, haltingly at first, she began to tell the story. How, in 1984, Joseph had lured her into the basement under the pretense of helping him with a door, how he had locked her away, cut her off from the world, and kept her there for 24 years. How she had given birth to 7 children, 3 of whom had been taken upstairs, 3 who remained locked below, and 1 who had died in infancy. The officers listened in stunned silence, the scale of what they were hearing sinking in. They promised her protection. They promised that her children would be safe, and for the first time in 24 years, Elisabeth allowed herself to believe it might be true. Later that night, police raided the house. Joseph was arrested on the spot. Officers descended into the hidden cellar, unlocking the heavy doors to find Stefan and Felix waiting, wide-eyed, unsure of who these strangers were. The world that had been kept from them for their entire lives was suddenly breaking in. The rescue was not the end of the pain. The years of trauma could not be erased in a single night, but it was the end of the captivity. Elisabeth and her children were taken into care, shielded from the public as they began the long process of healing. Joseph Fritzl, once the silent master of the underground world he had built, was now a prisoner himself. In March 2009, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for murder in the death of Michael, enslavement, rape, coercion, and false imprisonment. The man who had controlled every moment of Elisabeth's life for over 2 decades would spend the rest of his in a cell.